Welcome, friends, to a gathering place for the curious and the brave. Do you ever feel a shiver run down your spine on a perfectly ordinary day? Does the rustle of leaves in the wind sometimes whisper secrets in your ear? We delve into the realm of the unexplained. These are true stories, whispered through generations, passed down from campfire to campfire, each one abrush with the unseen. So settle in, adjust the lights, and prepare to be chilled. Tonight, we share true scary stories.
My scary story took place when I was at summer camp. It was something I went to every summer growing up, for a little more than 3 weeks at a time. I always had fun there, and it was always the highlight of my summer. There were some kids from my area who also went to the camp with me, so I always had some friends with me whenever I was there. There were also some kids I would only see once a year when I was there at the camp. I had been going so many times, though, that I knew most of these regulars very well. One year, in my early teens, a new camper showed up. He was someone I had never seen before, and he was someone I wished I'd never met either. The kid was huge, and he was a real jerk. He got off on being a really horrible bully. His name was Rex. Literally, it was the only person in my entire life I had ever met named Rex. I don't know why, but Rex took to me pretty badly in particular. I wasn't really ever bullied in my neighborhood or in school, so Rex was really the first bully I had ever come across in my life. He just loved making fun of me for some reason. For the most part, it wasn't that bad. This was summer camp after all, so more often than not, I was surrounded by a bunch of other guys my age who were very good friends with me, and often camp counselors as well. I didn't come across Rex too often. I was also very fortunate that he stayed in a different cabin than I did, so I was safe most of the time. But bullies are often the kind of pricks who pick their times when they want to pick on their victims, and Rex was definitely no different. I remember this was during a time that we were all hanging out in the river by camp swimming. All of the cabins were together at the time, both the boys and the girls. I didn't see it coming, but at one point suddenly something grabbed me from behind and pushed me down, holding me under the water. I don't know how many of you have actually breathed water into your lungs before, but it's a really painful situation. I had no advance warning that Rex was behind me when he grabbed me and did this. I was in the middle of breathing, so I inhaled a lot of water right away, and I didn't even get the chance to struggle very much at all. I don't remember a whole lot of what went on, but I do remember the intense pain and the panic before there was no memory at all. The camp counselors were able to get to me before it was too late. I mean, I guess that's sort of obvious since I am telling you this story, but apparently they had to perform CPR on me for a while. They revived me, but I have no memory of that at all. My first memory after is of me waking up in the hospital and my mom explaining what happened. This happened a very long time ago, so my memory about everything that occurred is not super clear. For that, I apologize. I do know that after that I never saw Rex again. I don't know what the consequences were for him, but I can imagine they were probably pretty severe. When I was 15, I was able to get my first job at a Starbucks across town from where I lived. It was the only place that would hire me without at least a high school diploma, let alone any special skills. I jumped at the chance as soon as they said I had the job. I had limited hours, of course, because I was still a minor, but still, at least I was making money, and I had an excuse to stay out of my home as well. My family life was really depressing, so I would have avoided going home either way until I had to, job or not. I worked the front counter and the drive-through window, which was pretty alright. I was on the debate team in high school, so even at that young age I was pretty good at convincing people to try out the new drinks. I was also able to make friends with some of my new coworkers easily. since a lot of them were kids only a little older than I was. Some were even on break from college and trying to earn some extra money to pay for next semester's tuition. I thought that was really cool. The job wasn't all fun and games, though, as anyone who works in service can tell you. Customers were confused even more than I was by the size names, and sometimes we got so much of a rush that my fingers felt like they had arthritis by the end of the shift. My coworkers' inside jokes made it all bearable, though, and even funny sometimes, until we had to go home for the night. Something changed a few months in, though, when Jerry started working there too. Jerry was a well-known older high school dropout who'd fallen on his ass a couple of times since. He was tolerated by the people around town in the hopes he'd get his act together one day. Falling on his ass likely means he was dealing drugs, but it's not something we could readily confirm. Anyway, as far as Starbucks coworkers go, Jerry had a very different vibe. He never talked to anyone unless he absolutely had to, which is a bad fit for a customer service job, as you can imagine. He was also very belligerent, often doing things wrong or slowly on purpose to piss someone off. I know it was on purpose, because he told us one of the few times he did feel like talking. That really riled up the rest of us. We were busy and we just wanted to get things done. Eventually, management had enough, and Jerry was called into the office. They told him that either he had to start keeping up or he'd be let go to find his next job. Jerry wasn't happy, and neither were the rest of us when he sped up just enough to avoid getting yelled at again. He would go out of his way to find ways to trip us up as much as he could get away with, though. He'd miscount ingredients and give us a smug smile when we realized, give customers the wrong drinks on purpose, show up just a little bit late all the time, and always with a bullshit excuse no one could prove or disprove. It dragged us all down, but we all tried to tolerate him until he moved on eventually. But of course he never did. He seemed to take real pleasure in doing less than the bare minimum, making money and causing misery at the same time, so he was damn sure going to stay. Still, it was honestly better for me than at home, Jerry or no. That is, until Jerry started targeting me specifically. He suddenly became uncharacteristically chatty whenever we ended up working in the same section of the shop, just with small talk at first, like the weather or how busy we were that day. After what he'd been doing, I was really put off by it and wondered if the sudden friendliness came from him being body snatched or something. Maybe a little ridiculous, but it was such a sudden change that a sci-fi alien takeover scenario honestly seemed more believable to me. Jerry also started asking me about how I was doing at school, what my hobbies were, if I liked the same video games he liked. Nothing so personal, but more than I was comfortable sharing with him. I gave him the bare minimum answers and went about my day, assuming that maybe he had a random epiphany while high to be nicer to the kids he worked with. He started getting really close to me, not emotionally, hell no, but physically. He would come up behind me and brush himself against my back by accident. Then he'd make fun of me when I'd give him a look. He said he was a fan of pranks and would also do that thing where you tap someone on the shoulder and quickly hide your hand and act like you didn't do it. Mild compared to the misery he caused, which he still did to everyone else by the way, but still really annoying. He continued to ask me more personal questions until we came upon the topic of allergies. I just said I was allergic to peanuts and left it at that, which was true. I carried an EpiPen for emergencies and told Starbucks about my allergy before I signed on, so I was allowed to not deal with anything with peanuts in it. Coincidentally, I tended to palm those orders off on Jerry, mostly because he stuck to me like grizzly glue. Jerry didn't believe me about my life-threatening allergy, though. He said there was the smell of peanut butter around all the time, and I didn't need to go to the hospital then. I told him that my form of the allergy was only really severe if I ate anything compared to peanuts. It just irritated my nose a little when I smelled it, which I took allergy meds for. He called bullshit and stuck to his own opinion. I just shrugged and thought to myself, whatever, let him believe what he believes. One day after school, I headed over to the Starbucks to start my shift. Employees in the shop were allowed a discount or one free drink a shift, which a lot of us took advantage of. I was honestly a huge coffee drinker in my teens, so the arrangement worked well for me. I'd make a simple latte and sip on it whenever I had a minute to myself, or take one with me on my walk home. On that day, we were slammed, so I made my latte quickly, set it down in the corner, and went back to work. I'd almost forgotten about it until later, until Jerry reminded me not to forget about it. I thanked him and said goodbye to my coworkers, who were more actually my friends now, and started the walk home. I took a sip as I walked out the doors and heard Jerry snickering at something. I kept walking and drinking when suddenly my throat started flaring up. It was a sick and familiar feeling. I was obviously having a reaction. I instantly felt like I wasn't getting enough air, and my throat felt hot, itchy, and was closing fast. I was beginning to get dizzy. I reached for the area where I usually kept my EpiPen, only to find it wasn't there. This is where I panicked. My fingers felt heavy as I struggled to tap out the passcode on my phone. I needed to call someone, my mom, 911. Only now I couldn't really breathe. I remember stumbling to the sidewalk and my breath just sucking out of me like a popped tire, and I passed out. Long story short, I woke up in the hospital, hooked up to a bunch of machines. My mom had taken the time out of her day to wait for me to wake up, and I was kind of relieved she did, because I couldn't remember a thing. Apparently, I was lucky. Some random person happened to be driving by when they saw me collapse a bit outside of the Starbucks and brought me to the hospital themselves. Luckily, I also had my state ID on me, and I noticed that I had a peanut allergy, so the staff knew exactly what to do to help me. I was only an inch away from death when they got my airways open. The doctor lectured me about making sure I had my EpiPen at all times, and I told him I usually do. I also never even remotely handled peanuts at my job. She was puzzled and asked where my EpiPen was if I always carried it with me. I told her I didn't know. It was usually kept in my back pocket, but when I reached for it, it wasn't there. I told her I didn't know how I came into contact with the peanuts either. The only thing I'd had that day, since getting to work, was my free coffee. My mind flashed to Jerry. I sat upright in the hospital bed. Jerry had been around me all day and didn't believe I had a peanut allergy. He also told me not to forget my coffee when I left. He'd laughed when I walked out the doors, as if he knew some fucked up secret I didn't. It all came together in an instant. He put something in my coffee to prove me wrong. I nearly hyperventilated. The doctor asked me what was wrong, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't face the truth that someone had put my life at risk to prove a stupid argument. It all felt too surreal, like if I blinked I would wake up and realize it had just been a dream. As soon as I was cleared, I went home. I was given a new EpiPen and called a couple of days later to quit my job. I never want to see Jerry again, and if I do, it'll be too soon. Back when I was 23, I was a single mom living in Melbourne, Australia. One morning, I dropped my eldest off at school in the morning and was walking with my youngest in the pram. As I was walking, I saw a man stood smoking across the road. He looked like a complete bogan. He had no top on, gold chains, and bad teeth, and when he saw me, he started walking across the road to cut me off on the pavement. I thought to myself, oh God, here we go. I crossed over, but he followed me again. My instincts were going haywire when suddenly he ran up behind me and started saying, "I love your baby. Let me hold him. Let me hold him." I said I was nearly home, and my partner would not be happy about him hassling me like this. He got all angry, saying he'd bash my partner and then bash me. I'd never felt my body prepare me so much for a fight or flight situation before. I was still on a steep hill, and I knew I couldn't let go of the pram to fight him off. There seemed to be nobody about at that time in the morning either, so no one to help me if he did try to attack me. As I got home, I rushed through the door, and by some miracle I managed to shut it before he could force his way in behind me. I hid my son upstairs in his cot and began frantically ringing the police. I saw the man climb over my back fence and begin looking through my patio doors right at me, fogging up the window with his manic smile. His teeth were really bad, honestly disgusting. I just remember the sight of them the most. The police response was brilliant though, as they arrived within just 15 minutes. By that time, the bloke had already gone. It turned out that after he had followed me home, he dragged another lady down an alleyway and tried to bash her. Her little barking dog saved her by barking so loud another man came to help. About 2 months later, the police caught him, with mine and the lady's help, and I'm happy to say he served 7 years in prison. We live in the country, around 5 miles from the nearest town, but on a somewhat busy road. I remember it was around 2 a.m. one Sunday morning, and I was the only person still up. I guess our house was the only one around with the lights still on. All of a sudden, there was a knock at our living room window. I opened the curtains to see a scruffy-looking young man dressed in all black. He was about 19 years old and asked me if I could give him a lift to the nearest town. He mumbled something about his friends throwing him out of their car and leaving him stranded. I politely told him I had been drinking, so I couldn't drive. I suggested that instead I could phone a taxi for him if he wanted. He started getting really anxious and aggressive, saying that he couldn't get a taxi to where he wanted to go. There was something clearly not right with this guy, but I had no idea how to help him. I told him the best bet was for me to phone the police and ask them to come out and help instead. After a bit of incoherent babbling, he set off walking away from the town. He was wearing black clothes in the middle of the night on a road where every other driver was probably intoxicated, tired, or distracted. So I decided to phone the local cop shop anyway just in case. They said they would send a car out to look for him, but I never heard back from them. I couldn't sleep that night, worrying about that guy. My wife, who had woken up, heard half the conversation and couldn't sleep, worrying that he would come back and murder us both in our beds. Myself and 2 friends, all from the Netherlands, went to Australia for a couple of months back in 2008. We rented a camper and drove up the entire East Coast. I remember one night, while we were in the middle of nowhere, we stopped at a petrol station. It was a station that kind of appeared out of nowhere, with nothing but fields around as far as the eye could see. We stopped for fuel, food, and hopefully a toilet. A freshen up break if they had a restroom as well. When we were walking into the station, everyone in there was what I think you might describe as being a hillbilly. They all just sort of stopped and looked at us as we went about our business. When I got to the till, the cashier was super non-social. He said they had a restroom and gave us the keys to it. We paid for our stuff and headed for the restroom to see it was covered from head to toe in blood and who knows what other kinds of fluids. We said no way, left and jumped in our camper and started to get the heck out of there. As we were pulling out though, 4 to 5 pickup-style trucks all pulled in and half blocked us in. Luckily, we managed to find a gap in between two of them and just about slipped out. We sped out of there, but the headlights in our rearview mirror seemed to last forever as they continued to follow us. It was a very scary experience. Even once we were out of there, it was really in the middle of nowhere, so streetlights weren't a thing at all. We didn't stop to sleep that night. We drove all the way until they stopped following us and kept driving until the morning as well. We then only crashed out once we were in the next city along the coast and could find a safe place to lay down. The strangest thing I can recall happening was something that happened with my daughter at a very young age. We were renting out a house that had an old barn out in the backyard. We had told our kids to stay out of the barn, but you know how children can be. When they want to get in and figure something out, they will do it. When you tell them not to do it, it will make them want to do it even more. So it wasn't a big surprise to us that our kids began getting into the barn. We at least made sure there wasn't anything dangerous in there that could hurt them. So whenever we found out they were in there, it wasn't as big a deal to us as it might have been before. Our 8-year-old daughter, though, one day sort of scared us. She told us that while she was out in the barn, someone had said hello and how are you to her. She said it was a very pleasant-sounding voice, so she wasn't scared at all. That didn't keep her dad and I from worrying, though. We went out to search the barn, and to make sure there was no one actually in there. We found absolutely no one, of course. My husband then had a really odd idea. He thought our daughter might have had an imaginary friend. I thought that the age of 8 was a bit too old for that to happen. Our 2 older children never even had one, but he thought maybe that was because they were boys and played together when they were young. It became a thing that we heard about at least once in a while. We would occasionally hear about her being in the barn and hearing someone saying only those 2 phrases to her. She would try talking back to whoever this was, but all her friend would say was those words back to her. I admit I found the situation very odd and thought it showed a lack of imagination that my girl had with her imaginary friend. I suppose not everyone can be super imaginative though, so it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't until one day that I was looking for my daughter when something really strange happened to me. I figured after looking throughout the house and not finding her inside, that she was probably out there in the barn, so I went out there to check in on her. Sure enough, she was out there, with some of her dolls playing. I went up to her and told her it was time for lunch, so she had to come in and wash up. It was then that I very clearly heard a strange-sounding voice say, "Hello, how are you?" I can't really explain how I felt in that moment. It was shocking, and I really mean that. There was a jolt of electricity that went through my body. My daughter was happy that finally someone other than her had actually heard the voice, but I was a little more than scared. I took my daughter and we got out of the apartment. I was worried that someone was hiding out in the barn and that we just hadn't found them the last time. I got in touch with my husband at work and he suggested I call the police. Well, I did call the police and told them I heard someone talking in the barn. I explained everything that was going on, and they came out to check. My daughter was really distressed for some reason, like she thought her friend was going to get into some sort of trouble. I wasn't sure what to do to make her feel better. I waited and watched at the kitchen window and was expecting the cops to come out with some crazy guy in handcuffs or something, but that didn't happen. After a while, the cops did emerge from the barn, but there was no person with them. I noticed one of the cops was carrying something, though. When I went to talk to them, I found myself somewhat embarrassed. The cop understood why I was scared before, but they seemed to be very amused. It turned out one of the cops was carrying a raven with him. This lonely little raven had been hiding out in the barn and was talking to us the whole time. They proved it by having him talk to me in the exact voice I had heard. It turns out the raven was a pet the previous tenants had, but it had escaped and they'd lost him. When they moved out, they thought they would never see him again. Fortunately, we were able to get the raven back to them. It may not seem too scary by the end of the story, but trust me, when you're sure you're by yourself and you keep hearing a strange voice call out to you with no idea what it is or where it's coming from, that will scare the hell out of you too. I used to go and spend time at my friend's house often when I was growing up. We both met in high school and were friends from a very young age. However, whereas I lived in town, he lived in a completely rural area. At a certain age, we began having weekend sleepovers. Our parents didn't drive us over though. We would just take the other's bus home from school on a Friday afternoon. We would be doing this sort of thing very regularly for most of our entire childhood. My buddy, Carl, and I used to explore the countryside that surrounded the house he grew up in. By the time we were in our teens, we were very familiar with it, and actually quite bored with it too. We had been out hiking in that area so many times, there weren't any areas that we didn't know by heart. When we were 14 years old, however, I had a new experience. One of our mutual friends who was 15 was driving his dad's old pickup ever since his dad got a new vehicle. He didn't have a license, but as long as we stayed in the rural areas, he wouldn't get in trouble for driving. Even though it was thrilling enough to just be sitting in the back bed of the truck drinking a beer we had stolen from Carl's dad, we also wanted to explore areas we hadn't had chances to before. So about 4 of us got together early one Saturday morning and went driving way out into the hills. We were looking for some place that was as far out as we could find, and we could be exploring what we considered to be unknown territory. We drove around quite a lot, trying to find some of the deepest woods we could find, yet still accessed by road. We ended up driving off-road when the road ended, but it still looked like other vehicles had driven along that ground. We figured that made it safe to do. Eventually, though, we went ahead and stopped the truck when the trees got too thick to really drive any further. This was easily the furthest out in the country I had ever been in my life. That excited rather than scared me, though. This gave us a completely new area to look around in. The 4 of us strayed apart from each other, while also sticking together. We made sure all of us were in vocal range, and would rarely get out of each other's sight either. We didn't know exactly what we were looking for, only that we were indeed out there looking for something. I don't know how long we were out there before Carl and I heard one of the other guys yelp. It was a weird noise he made, and it sounded like he was in distress. In that moment, he was out of sight, so we had to rush over to where we thought we heard his yelp come from. All 3 of us went over the hill we were hiking on, and stopped when we saw what made our friend call out. There were at least 7 full-grown adults, dressed in camouflage, sitting at a camp on the side of the hill. They looked like they were actually military guys, and not just a bunch of backwoods people pretending like they were. One of the guys was holding our friend who had yelped, with their hand over his mouth. The 3 of us reacted poorly. We were about to turn around and start running. I guess we selfishly only wanted to protect ourselves. We didn't even get the chance to perform this cowardly act, though. Several of the military men pulled guns on us and stopped us in our tracks. They ordered us over to their camp, and the 3 of us were scared to death we were all going to be shot. I didn't know what to do, but I was terrified. I was just going to do whatever these soldiers told me to do, in hopes I wasn't going to get shot and killed. The soldiers ordered the 4 of us over there and into one of the tents they had set up. They didn't tie us or anything, but one of them told us they had better not hear a peep out of us, or we would regret it. He definitely spoke with an accent, but it wasn't one I recognized, or even nowadays could even guess as to what it was. The four of us sat there in the tent terrified, and we heard some talking going on outside. We were unable to make out what was being talked about. Carl kept trying to whisper about trying to find a way out, but we shushed him. Finding a way out of there and getting away from 7 soldiers with guns wasn't going to be easy. Eventually, they blindfolded all 4 of us and tied our hands behind our backs. I was absolutely sure they were going to kill us. They took us and began guiding us away from the camp, although I had no idea what direction they were taking us off to. The only thing I could tell was they were guiding us downhill. Eventually, they put us all in the back of a vehicle and began driving. It was at least an hour's worth before they finally stopped. At one point after that, they stopped and began untying our hands. When the blindfolds were removed, we noticed we were in the back of our friend's truck. The guy untying us, the guy with the accent, told us to get in the truck and do our best to forget everything we saw that day. He said the only reason he was letting us live was that they couldn't have people searching for missing children out in the woods. If we knew what was best for us, we wouldn't tell anyone anything. We drove off immediately. They had driven the truck along with a truck of their own toward an unfamiliar area, and we had to find out where we were and drive back home. We talked about what we had seen, but none of us were really sure. We weren't sure if they were American troops, foreign troops, or members of a backwoods militia. We didn't know what to do. Carl and I kept it to ourselves. I'm not too sure about the other guys, though. Carl and I figured the guy's advice was quite sound. We were willing to do our best and just forget about them. This was back in the 70s, and Carl and I are still friends. We don't know what happened to the other 2 guys, though. We've told this story many times since then, and we figure there's no chance we'd be in danger now. We both really thought we were going to die back then, though. I heard this story from a good friend of mine. He isn't the type to make up stuff. Way too serious of a guy, to be honest. Anyway, my friend works in forests. He tends the natural parks and woods. I guess you could say he's a bit like a park ranger of sorts. One day, when he was out in the woods with another park employee, he heard something slightly alarming. He said that he heard the sound of someone calling someone in a faint and distant voice. He and his coworker stopped and stood in place. They tried to listen in a little closer and see if they could make out the words that were being said, or at least ascertain the direction the voice was coming from. When they paused and listened in closer, my friend was shocked to hear that it sounded like someone was calling out to him specifically. The voice was calling his name. Now who could that be? He wondered. He was about to respond with a call of his own, but his colleague stopped him. His colleague raised an arm in the air and glared at my friend. He raised a finger to his mouth to indicate the universal "be quiet" gesture. His colleague then spoke. That's what they call the caller. Most of the time, it's a phenomenon where you hear sounds and noises that sound like voices out here in the forest. In the mountains, most of the time it sounds like a voice. At best, you might be able to make out a word perhaps, but you have to be very, very careful when it sounds like someone is calling out your name. If you go and search for the owner of that voice, you won't be coming back. That's why you get so many missing persons cases out in the elements. There's something out there, and it wants to take you away. Well, my friend was really shocked, to say the least. He really didn't expect to get some kind of weird superstition or urban legend crash course while out at work that day. I guess he's way too much of a serious guy to buy into any of that sort of thing. I think that's what caused him to respond in the way he did. Well, where does it want to take me away then? I don't know, why don't you reply if you're that interested? or if you want to find out." Needless to say, my friend did not reply to the voice or try to find the owner. The two of them ignored the voice as it continued to call out my friend's name. I think that day my friend opened his mind a little more to the unknown. It's a creepy world out there sometimes. I used to work security, and several years ago I was assigned to a remote construction site where a summer camp was being built. It was quite literally in the middle of the woods, roughly 4 to 5 miles into the forest, with only a single access road. They'd been using it to haul equipment and supplies, and as such, my job was to provide overnight security, doing a foot patrol of the entire area. The patrol area covered 2 miles in all. Roughly once every hour or so, I would go back to my post in a tiny wooden shack, not much bigger than a phone booth, honestly. I'd fill in my logs and notes. Other than the occasional black bear or coyote, it was a very boring assignment, with one exception. I was doing a routine patrol one night. It was near the end of my shift at around 3 a.m. or so. I'd just passed the gate where the access road enters the site, when suddenly I heard an extremely loud and piercing scream coming from the distance down the road. It sounded like a woman screaming in absolute terror, so I immediately took off sprinting as fast as I could in that direction. I didn't hear anything else after the initial scream. About a quarter of a mile or so down the road, I came upon a car parked off just to the side. There was no car in sight when I'd come through on my way to make my shift, so it must have parked there fairly recently. It wasn't running, and no lights were turned on either. None of the doors were open. I called out to see if anyone was there, only to receive no answer. I looked around the general area, but I didn't see a thing. Needless to say, this whole situation was pretty damn sketched out. At this point, I ran back to my post and called in what I'd seen and heard to the police. There wasn't really anything else I could do on my own. Unfortunately, nothing ever really came of it. I never found out whose scream I heard or what caused it. Apparently, the car was owned by a guy who lived in the area, but I never heard why he was there. My supervisor suggested that maybe I'd heard a mountain lion or animal screaming, but I've heard those sounds before, and although they're freaky, there's no mistaking it for an honest-to-goodness human if you know what it sounds like. This happened to a friend of mine whilst he was attending some sort of mountain climbing club, I guess. He and some friends in the club were set up to meet at a campsite before taking off on a local mountain hike. One of the members of his team was running a bit late though, so he waited at the campsite for him to show. They were eating into their hiking time slowly though. His friend wasn't a bad climber at all. He was familiar with that particular mountain range too, so naturally the team were growing a little concerned by his extended lateness. They started to worry if maybe something had happened to him. It wasn't until it got completely dark that he finally showed up to the campsite. Everyone was relieved, but had a collective question in their minds. Where the heck have you been? When that question was asked aloud, the response the missing team member gave was nothing short of unusual. I set off early to meet you all here on time, but I ran into something I really can't explain. Did you guys pass by a spot where a broken street light was kind of flickering on and off? Did you see that? He asked. The group agreed that they'd passed the same broken light that he was talking about right now. Right, well, when I got close to that light, I saw something underneath it. It looked like the figure of a woman wearing really dirty clothes. The team members exchanged glances of concern, and some even snickered at the late team member. Well, yeah, I mean, you wouldn't expect to see a woman out on the mountain trail that far in without any gear. You know, it caught me so off guard that I didn't know what to do. I just stopped and watched for a while from a distance. At a certain point, I realized something. The woman was reappearing and disappearing at times. I know, that makes no sense at all, but I don't mean it as an analogy or anything. I mean that she literally disappeared and reappeared every time the light flickered on and off. When the light was on, she wasn't there, and when the light turned off, she was. I couldn't make any sense of what I was seeing. I looked at her from so many angles as I could to try and make sure I wasn't just seeing things. I just didn't like what I was seeing. I thought, it could be a ghost or something, and there's no way in hell I'm tangling with the paranormal out in the middle of the woods. I had to make a choice, either pass right by her underneath that broken light, or go the long way around and be late. And now you know exactly what choice I made. He explained himself with a look of disappointment on his face. Everyone seemed a little concerned. I guess they weren't sure exactly what to believe. The way my friend tells this story makes it sound like after a little while they dismissed what he saw and continued on with their night. Some of his friends made fun of him for using the paranormal as an excuse for being late. They berated him and said things like, "What a lame excuse." He told me about that story 6 months ago, and I thought, yeah, cool, seems kinda creepy, but I didn't really think much more of it than that. I thought it was all said and done with, and I kind of forgot about it. So needless to say, I was more than a little surprised when my friend brought it up again this week. We met up to do a little mountain hiking of our own, and I'd actually gotten interested in mountain climbing during those 6 months that passed by. "Hey, do you remember that story I told you about my mountain climbing friend and his lame excuse of the broken light?" I replied, "Yeah, what about it? Is that why you were late?" He was late, by the way. It was quite annoying to me. No, I saw it too." I smiled and exhaled through my nose, expecting this to be the punchline of some lame joke he was trying to set up. The only thing was, his face didn't show any signs of humor. He wasn't kidding, and to be honest, he looked a little pale. We were in the same place his friend said he'd seen it, and we were going on a hike in the same mountain course, so it did kind of make sense he went by that same area. He was very serious. There was definitely a woman who appeared and disappeared on the mountain trail beneath that flickering light. It was just like his friend had said. Like his friend, he was way too scared to go anywhere near her. He also described her appearance as shadowy and said she was wearing filthy clothes. I've known this friend for years, and he never came out with anything like this before. I still don't know whether or not to believe him. I mean, is this just some kind of sorry I'm late excuse that mountain hikers use? Or is there really an apparition on this mountain trail? Perhaps the spirit of a hiker who perished in the elements or something. Well, apparently multiple people I know have seen this woman. I don't know if there are others out there, and the truth remains a mystery to me. I was in the mountains of North Carolina for several days. It was beautiful and peaceful, hiking with my brother, sister, and their friend Caleb. That is, until one early morning at around 3 a.m., every creature in a 10-mile radius was chirping, squeaking, howling, or scampering through the woods and making those bumps in the night. Being from the Midwest and having survived 2 tornadoes, I thought the worst weather event of my life was about to occur, and there I was sleeping in a hammock. For those of you who don't know, just before a tornado is formed above your head, every animal in sight will start behaving strangely and get the hell out of there. They know somehow. They can just feel it. You can kind of feel it too, I guess. But you just won't know exactly what you're feeling until you've been through it many times. Not until the 60-year-old tree beside you is being ripped from the ground. Being in the eye of the tornado is even more strange when it occurs, as all of those same animals will suddenly freeze. Sure, they're still there and exist, but their little soul is on hold almost. They just don't do much more than look around silently. It's very creepy. Anyway, there was no tornado at all. At 3 a.m., the fire we'd made was just down to embers, and the roaring thunder of animals freaking out surrounded me. I peeked my head out of the hammock, imagining getting my face smashed in by the first softball-sized hail or something. That would be just my luck for looking. But no, to my surprise, there was no bad weather at all. No storm or looming catastrophe. It was just a beautiful night, aside from all the animals going crazy. My brother peeked his head out of the hammock above me and looked down to see if I was awake. When he saw my eyes as wide as saucers, he whispered, "What the hell is going on out there?" I replied that I really didn't know, but I wished I was up there in his hammock instead of being on the ground level. Being on the ground level usually is best for guys my size, around 235 pounds. I lacked the grace to climb up hammock ropes and jump into bed, 8 feet off the ground. The terrifying, creepy sounds continued for about 30 seconds and then suddenly stopped altogether. It was like there was a sweeping effect going on. The outside of the radius stopped first, and the creatures closer to us stopped one by one until it was all silent around us. It was almost synchronized. It was so crazy. My brother and I freaked out. After 5 minutes of absolute silence, we got out of the hammocks and started the fire again. This time, we made sure it was big enough to light up 100 feet out. The last thing we needed was Bigfoot or some other weird stuff going down right now. My brother went to check up on the ridge for my sister and Caleb. They were about 60 feet uphill from our hammocks. Caleb always wanted to be at the highest possible safe spot so he could watch the sun rise from his hammock. As soon as my brother got there, he yelled a shrieking kind of yell for me, the kind I had only heard twice before. Once when his friend got his bike handle lodged into his stomach about an inch deep, and once when he split his own head open. I ran up the ridge with an axe in hand, first aid in my left, and flashlight in my teeth, expecting the worst. When I arrived at Caleb's bottom bunk, he was in a state of shock, eyes wide open, shivering and shaking as he was staring down the valley. Wouldn't you know it, my sister hadn't even woken up. She had her headphones in all night, listening to folk music apparently. She hates the sounds of animals and prefers to have a controlled mental state. We woke her up, and she had no idea what was going on. We eventually got Caleb down to the fire and wrapped him up in some blankets. I gave him a shot of whiskey to sip on, but he mostly just held it and stared into the fire the whole night. It was all just too weird for sleep. Finally, he laid down next to the fire and fell asleep at around 5 a.m. The sun came up, and my siblings and I decided to leave the fire and go see the sunrise from the ridge. We all sat in Caleb's hammock, still bewildered as to what occurred the night before. Caleb had really picked out the best spot you could imagine. My brother then spotted something strange, though. "What's that?" he said, pointing down the valley. Right there on the bank of the river was something we couldn't quite make out. We noticed there was some sort of clearing down there. We decided to go check it out, but one of us had to stay with Caleb. My sister volunteered, as she really hates creepy things. She didn't want us to go down, but we insisted. I left her my axe and emergency GPS signal device and told her to scream if she needed us, not to hesitate to use her pepper spray either. My brother and I hiked down to the river. It took about 20 minutes. When we arrived, we felt very uncomfortable. There were no animals around, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. The clearing on the riverbank was about 100 yards upstream. We took to the higher side of the bank to keep our distance. I don't think either of us actually expected anything to go down, but we wanted to remain cautious just in case. When we were around 50 yards away at a slight elevation to the clearing, we pulled out our phones to take pictures. Our phones were dead though. Mine is known to die, but I have an external battery pack that attaches that I know was fully charged. My brother's phone was always reliable, and usually he had his portable solar charger attached too, but it was dead as well. We both tried to hold our power buttons to no avail. It was about 100 feet across, this clearing, in the shape of a triangle. All of the bushes and plants that typically grew alongside the river had been flattened. There were even some mature bushes that typically stand about 6 to 8 feet tall that were lying flat as well, as if something in a triangle shape had bent down as close to the ground as it could get. Nothing appeared broken though, rather as if it had always grown along the earth instead of growing up toward the sun. When we got back to camp, Caleb was awake, and my sister had a weird look on her face. Caleb was being totally normal. "Hey bro, you alright?" my brother asked. "Yeah, I'm doing fine. Missed the sunrise. I guess I needed the sleep." We looked at him concerned. He was eating a breakfast bar and heating up some coffee. We sat down across from him, and I asked him, do you remember that weird stuff from last night?" He looked puzzled. My brother added some more. "You know, when the animals all freaked out and we found you?" He looked so confused. My sister said, "Caleb, stop playing." He asked what we were talking about. My brother said he was so messed up last night, and Caleb laughed and responded, "Yeah, I figured I had to be because I've never slept next to the fire all wrapped up in blankets." We continued to probe him, but he seemed to have no memory whatsoever. As far as he was concerned, he had too many drinks and slept next to the fire. We told him our story, and each of us agreed, but he had no recollection. We told him about the strange spot next to the river and how our phones wouldn't turn on. When we pulled out our phones to show him, they turned on once more. My brother had 67%, and I had 41. That gave us the creeps real quick. We decided to pack up camp and get the hell away from this weird spot. Before we did a final sweep, Caleb asked if we'd seen his camera. He had a nice DSLR Sony with a very good lens, but it was gone. The weirdest part is that he slept with it in his hammock every single time he went camping, and we'd never seen it not on his body. He even specifically remembered taking it to bed and tucking it into his bag, putting the lens in its special sleeve. It's like a ritual for him. We searched around the ridge, all around the fire, and in between the two spots, but it was nowhere to be found. Caleb even went down the ridge a bit toward the river, just in case it had fallen out and rolled down the hill. It was nowhere to be seen. We had to leave, and my siblings and I agreed to pitch in and buy him a new one if he would just get out of there. About 3 miles and an hour later, my brother turned to me on the trail and said, "Do you think he tried to take a picture of something he wasn't supposed to see?" The creepiest feeling swept over me, and I replied, "Let's just forget about how messed up this all was and get the hell away from here." He nodded in agreement. It's been a few years now, and we haven't heard or seen from Caleb in at least 8 months. No one has. I was in a grocery store doing my weekly shop when I was approached by a man who said I was very pretty. He asked for my number. No intros, no asking me how I was doing, just getting straight into it. I politely declined him and said I was not interested. He became very persistent though, so I ended up telling him to instead give me his number so I could end this interaction as soon as possible. He gave me his number and I went back to shopping without incident, or so I thought. It turns out the man was keeping an eye on me the entire time. He watched me as I was walking up and down the different aisles. As I was getting ready to head to the checkout, he decided to approach me again. This time he was super angry and even started to yell at me, asking why I won't just give him my number. I decided to be direct and told him I would not just give him my number. I told him I'd said I wasn't interested and I would not be giving my number to a total stranger. He really took issue with this. He became furious and had to be removed from the store entirely. When I walked to my car, he ended up following me, even out of the parking lot. I was on my own street when I noticed I was still being followed by him. I drove past my house and started driving toward the police station in my city. He followed me the entire way there until he realized I was turning into the station. Then he finally sped off. Luckily, I haven't seen him again since then. I remember I was walking home from work at around 11 p.m. or so. I walked home every night for years to the exact same place, and I never had a single issue. I never listened to my music too loud just in case though. For about a mile on this day, I could hear someone yelling behind me. They weren't that close to me though, and I couldn't make out anything they were saying, so initially I didn't think they were talking to me. I started to get a really bad vibe though, and decided to mute my music for a bit. I heard the voice getting closer and closer, but still couldn't make anything out. That was until I heard a really distinct, "I just really don't like people." I turned around and suddenly saw this skinny man just sprinting at me full force from behind. I remember his arms were flailing behind him uncontrollably. I quickly made to cross the street to see if he would follow behind me. I turned to stare at him as he continued to run right up to me and got in my face. As he stopped in front of me, there was a weird tension in the air. Calmly and very suddenly, he said to me, "That's exactly what I would have done," and then continued on, turning left and running to the train station about a block ahead. It gave me the most unsettling feeling, and I was definitely ready to fight if I needed to. The guy had the most whacked out vibe I'd probably ever seen. Most likely he was on something. I was playing at the end of the trailer park when a guy pulled up in a convertible. He said he knew my mom and held up a Polaroid across the front seat, saying it was her. I saw the lady in the picture didn't have the right hair color, so I said, "That's not my mom." He simply said, "Sure it is," and then told me to get into his car. I said no and started backing away, and he got very frustrated. He insisted I should come closer so I could take a look at the picture better and be sure that it wasn't her. I said no and that I was actually going to get lunch with my mom right now. He gave a fake smile and left, so I turned around. My neighbor was walking up with an odd expression and her purse. I found out a few years later that the same man had been abducting and touching kids in the city for about 3 years by that time. I was only an arm's grab away from being another one of his victims.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that little notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you have your own encounter you'd like to share, leave a comment below. Who knows, it might just find its way into a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the scariest stories are often the ones closest to home.